Hi all, welcome back. I've got a cheap headset and an ambitious agenda today, and we're going to try and do about 25. We're going to do the first quarter century of U.S. history and late 1990s included, so at least 30 years. Now I know that's ridiculous, but I'm keenly aware. So is anything. I mean, doing the history of the U.S. post-Civil War in one semester is a ridiculous project. Uh, each decade could be a course in itself, and sometimes one smaller period can be, right? So history is like that. Everything is infinitely reducible. Also the opposite, right? And you've probably seen, maybe not, but you have to, the South Park History of America in 4 minutes. Brilliant, right? So the opposite is also true and can be very valuable. Yeah, so we can get a lot uh, out of U.S. history in a broader format like we've had, and today I'm not intimidated by this effort to encapsulate really our times, right? And keenly aware going into it that there are now courses on just 21st century U.S. history. I found one from some Ivy League school with the title of something like, the history of your life, right? That basically your time period. Uh, anyway, obviously speaking to a certain generation. Okay, but in any case, that's what we're doing today. So quite a bit, and I think you're going to enjoy the ride. So fasten your seatbelts. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's start by pointing out that the 1990s really, in many ways, is a prosperous time. It's a fairly peaceful time. Uh, yes and no. And yeah, end of the Cold War. In fact, as we'll talk about, Francis Fukuyama, the famous philosopher, even declares it is the end of history. It's also marked by this transition from the neoconservative administrations of Reagan and Bush Senior to this hip, young, kind of middle class Bill Clinton, right? Governor of Arkansas, formerly governor of Arkansas. Now, ironically, it's not Reagan with his talk of small government, or Clinton or Bush, right? Who get a handle on government spending, right? It is Clinton, right? Who really is the first to stop the deficit spending for decades, right? And now we saw the famous New York debt clock run backwards and then turned off shortly afterwards. Now that clock had been installed in 1989 in New York, an outside building, massive clock, by this New York real estate developer who wants to raise awareness about the unfeasibility, the path that America is on, right? Kind of a doomsday clock, but yeah, it started to run backward early in 2000 because national debt was decreasing. The Clinton years sees the U.S. pay down 450 billion in debt. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't last, and the deficit clock is restarted under Bush Jr. And as of 2019, it registered at 22 trillion. As of 2026, somewhere like 36 trillion. So going up faster and faster all the time. So that theme of government out of control is a continuing one. In any case, that several other big cultural shifts I want to talk in this period, and one of those is that the late 80s and 1990s is definitive end of the free love era. Okay, that hedonism of the type that is symbolized in Studio 54 really fizzles out in the later 1980s. And partly this is that generational lesson that the beatniks first learned, which is, hey, drugs turn out to be addictive. But also, and more, it's because harder drugs like crack cocaine start to appear. And at the same time, you've got this growing drug addiction related homelessness, which actually ties back to those beatniks. In fact, recall Ken Kesey's book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? Now this becomes a bestseller in 1962, but then becomes a film in 1975. It's one of the more important films of modern times, in that Jack Nicholson plays this great role, and it's a very well received, very popular movie. And what it does is really cast a light on the abuses that are happening within institutions, psychiatric institutions. We talked before in this course about how the over institutionalization of people in America, beginning really already in the 1920s with psychopathic hospitals that largely target women, often single women, right? And so at a time when it's very easy to have people institutionalized. And that only grows in the post-war period. Right? But a critique of that begins with in the post-war, with the pacifists in World War II who are stuck in institutions, in psychiatric institutions. This actually happens, and they begin the movement really against the abuses that happen here and the over-incarceration of people against their will. And it's an interesting story because it's both the right and the left are complicit in the demise of institutions and deinstitutionalization. This great experiment of closing psychiatric institutions and going for the community model of housing, which, as we've seen in every Western country, kind of fails. Right, and that graph there is a great example of that, of how the mentally ill, a lot of them end up housed in a different place, which is incarcerated in prison. But and many more of them simply become homeless. But as I say, the right and the left are complicit in this. And if you take this in other courses like sociology or whatever, you'll learn that in the 1970s, the left is very much about that psychiatry is a discursive hegemonic project that is inherently abusive, and much of the psychiatric language is inherently abusive, right? And again, often targeted against women and minorities. And always sets us up with the catch-22 that once you were called neurotic or you're called this or that, it's impossible not to prove it. So it's the one place where postmodern theory really is useful, discourse analysis, right? Because the discourse in psychiatry is inherently powerful and disempowering of others, right? Of the marginalized. So that is the critique of the left. And of course, the critique on the right is that government needs to be small and should not be operating massive institutions, and less government, better government. And clearly that's, we know that. And also the putative, the supposed war on government spending. And definitely that gets targeted towards social welfare programs. That's the idea, and as we saw in the Reagan era, that doesn't actually work. But that's why the right is also complicit in the demise of institutions. In any case, they are shuttered at a huge savings initially for governments everywhere, but the cost is more than paid out at the other end, as most of these former inmates are in institutions where they're no longer coerced to stay, and end up getting booted out. And really, that's the story and the glory of why we get the massive rise in homelessness in North America in the 1980s and 90s, a term that hadn't really been used and heard before. So you didn't hear about homelessness in the 70s, but you certainly do by the later 80s and 90s. So that's one thing. There's also more going on here that all intersects with this changing culture of the time, but the new homelessness thing is really consequential to our times as well. Another thing I want to point out from this here is that AIDS means that the AIDS epidemic means a lot of things. But one thing it means is that free sex is now a death sentence or potential death sentence, right? And that gets tied back to drug use, because intravenous needle users begin to die of AIDS as well in pretty good numbers. Significantly more money is spent on the war of drugs, of course, than on AIDS research in the U.S. throughout the 1980s. And the federal anti-drug budgets were in the billions of dollars annually. Dedicated AIDS funding started at only a few $100,000 in 1981 and only gradually increased over the decade, right? Basically because many conservative values at the time, right? This is seen as a judgment for that type of lifestyle, right? Now, Nancy Reagan's answer to all of this, of course, when we've looked at that, is very simple, and specifically to drugs, but it's the power of her message, the anti-drug message, is severely curtailed or undermined by the fact that her husband is assisting the drug dealing Contra rebels in Nicaragua, and the fact that the CIA is involved in cocaine trafficking. And this is what makes the 1990s so refreshing, because now we have Hillary Clinton coming to office, and she's got massive energies, and those considerable energies go into a very different direction, which is a proposal for universal health care for America, right? And also for taking better care of AIDS patients along with that. So here's Hillary Clinton with this common sense health reform initiative with really a lot of initial support. And then that erodes. Okay? Really, unfortunately, healthcare becomes partisan, becomes a political issue, politicized, uh, with Hillary herself, as she becomes a pilloried, right? Hillary is pilloried through kind of through a series of minor scandals, but mainly a large part of it is that she's really seen as unrelatable. Now, it doesn't help that she's a strong woman, right? And either way, we get this protracted, very personal anti-Hillary crusade in the 1990s. At the same time that Bill Clinton's infidelities are absorbing America's attention for 6 long years. And of course, we have to go there. So, best quote ever, Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky probe. Monica Lewinsky was a 22-year-old intern that it's revealed that he's having sex with in the White House. Now, Clinton is asked in this hearing whether his lawyer in the past had been truthful in this earlier deposition involving another affair where Clinton's, when he had been governor of Arkansas. And Clinton's lawyer had said at that in that deposition that's the hearing for that one, he said there is no sex going on. And so here Clinton is asked whether that is a true statement, and he says today, right, vis-a-vis Monica Lewinsky, and then he says, well, it depends on what the meaning of the word is, right, and never has been. That's one thing. If it means there is none, that was a completely true statement. Super confusing. Look up the transcript. I'll look up the video of it. It's filmed. But if you didn't know about this, this is a real gem from the past, and it's probably the best evasive semantic dodge in American history. In any case, Clinton gets impeached, the smooth-tongued Clinton. People aren't buying it, but the Senate doesn't ratify that, so Clinton kept his job. What is the legacy of all this? Well, pretty brutal on Hillary Clinton, who's really having to defend staying with Bill Clinton. But also some say that it really changed things for good. This is 1998. This is early internet days, and it's the first in that this is being followed in social media more than in public media, in respectable print media. So they're no longer the gatekeepers really of information at that point. That's the learning here. Now we're in the era of trial by memes. It's a precursor too to the Me Too movement, which is also about power imbalance. Switching to foreign affairs and build up to 9/11, one thing less remembered about the Clinton presidency is that moment the CIA had Osama bin Laden in its crosshairs and failed to act. Backstory here is during Russia's war in Afghanistan, the CIA starts to support the Afghan Mujahideen. We've talked about this before, the groups that are fighting the Soviets. And their greatest success is in anti-helicopter rocket launchers, which are these Stinger missiles. Very simple and not expensive at all for the U.S. Very costly for the Russians, to the point it really upsets or really is a key factor in their failure there. So it's just such a great example of asymmetrical warfare, and in fact, it's one of the most effective operations ever conducted by the CIA. In any case, Osama bin Laden is there, and he's there with other foreign Arab volunteers that have joined the anti-Soviet resistance efforts alongside all these other Afghan Mujahideen factions. And this directly led to the formation of Al-Qaeda there in Afghanistan, fighting the Soviets. That's its birth story. But It's also not this simple story. It's sometimes depicted in movies of the Americans supporting groups that later become radicalized and a threat to the U.S. Right? So that simple narrative that we created the monster that then took us out. Very little American funding is getting to these Arabs fighting the Soviets, and so Bin Laden really is not created by the CIA. That makes for a good story, but not quite so simple. But they are, at that point, on the same side, which itself is fascinating. Well, in case these Mujahideen succeed, as we know, and the Soviets do pull out of Afghanistan, and after that, the U.S. loses its interest in this region. But Bin Laden starts to come on the radar again as he becomes a threat. And that happens because to the Americans, not to the Soviets, and that's because that really begins with the Desert Storm War. Okay, January 1991, Desert Storm, and this is that 42 nation coalition led by the Americans that attacked the Iraqi army that had just invaded Kuwait. And in saving Kuwait, which the Iraqis made an argument that it was traditionally their land. In any case, saving this oil-rich small nation from Saddam Hussein, and no shortage of cynicism why the Americans choose to go to battle for this small, rich oil state. In any case, in doing that, the Americans build up their forces in Saudi Arabia. And that's a first, right? This is Bin Laden's home country, and that is deeply offensive to conservative Muslims. And this presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. Okay? And that only grows. After the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, by that point there's about 500,000 military personnel in Saudi Arabia, but they don't leave. Okay, so that becomes a central grievance. The staying power, or the fact that the Americans are staying here, which is seen by them as having been the long-term plan all along, right? This apparently permanent presence of the infidel forces in what is the land of the Prophet, the land of the two holiest sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina. So this is seen by Islamists as a profound violation of Islamic law and really a provocation, or it should be seen as a provocation, they believe, to the entire Muslim world. Right? That is a big sticking point, but it's also American support for Israel, which is a longer standing issue. In any case, Bin Laden's group, Al Qaeda, they bomb U.S. targets in the Middle East and Africa well before 9/11, including the U.S. Embassy in Kenya, where hundreds are killed. That was just a brutal attack. CIA is tracking Bin Laden, obviously, and they do find him in Kandahar. And Clinton later said, he said this direct quote, "I nearly got him, and I could have killed him, but I would have had to destroy a little town called Kandahar in Afghanistan and kill 300 innocent women and children, and then I would have been no better than him, and so I didn't do it." So he says this while he's in Australia, hours before the Twin Towers are hit. So it's just incredible. Truth is, though, Clinton he did have to make this decision, but as the 9/11 Commission later shows, that missile strike that he didn't approve would have missed Bin Laden in any case. He was gone. But in any case, yeah, 9/11, obviously, globally defining moment. In the way that the Pearl Harbor attack was, but in some ways a lot more so. The Japanese attack had been anticipated. It was believed it would be in Guam or the Philippines. 9/11 was not anticipated. And in fact, after the end of the Cold War, it seemed that there was really no more existential threat to America or even to world peace. It's a Pax Americana, and that's a really important point. Getting back to that idea that really it was the end of history. This is what Francis Fukuyama famously declared in the year 2000. And what he meant is there's this new consensus about global democratic capitalism and with one superpower in the world. And 9/11 seemed to prove him horribly wrong. Right? So here we have this well-orchestrated show of terrorist theater, really, and it's if you think about it, it's targeting the symbols of American capitalism in the Twin Towers, right? The American military in the Pentagon, and the American government in the U.S. Capitol, the failed strike on the U.S. Capitol. So how did this happen? Well, there were many answers. The how is actually simpler than the why, right? And political philosopher John Gray pointed out soon after that it was really a mistake to believe that this idea of the end of history and this idea that modernity is incompatible with this kind of a thing, right? And specifically with terrorism based on a 7th century doctrine and religious fundamentalism going back to Muhammad, right? And in fact, Al Qaeda was thoroughly modern in its worldview of purification through violence, notwithstanding its medieval religious orientation. Now, others viewed this as a wake-up call to what Samuel Huntington, political scientist, famously called the clash of civilizations. And he had warned, in fact, ahead of time, before 9/11, that this would be the main conflict in the post-Cold War world. And that was so validating about him after that, that it would be a battle between the East and the West that could no longer be ignored and would erupt. And yeah, so in some ways he saw this coming. Where a vocal few like him saw 9/11 or viewed it as this consequence too of American imperialism, the dominant narrative was George W. Bush's far simpler take, and that is that these were simply evildoers, and our task was very clear, which is, quote, to rid the world of the evildoers, and that was his full-on game plan. And in fact, when Americans asked, why do they hate us? There were many answers, but to drill down there, bin Laden's worldview matters the most, and it's a theological worldview of radical Islamism, which took root in the 1920s after World War I and was energized by that promise to reverse history. Specifically to restore the caliphate, the line of prophets going back to Muhammad, which had been cut off with the secularization of Turkey and the abolition of the caliphate. So that is one thing, but it's also part of that agenda is to get the Jews and the Crusaders out of the Muslim Holy Land. Right? And this is laid out in the Crusaders being the Christian nations of the world, which is that worldview, right? That the West are the Christian nations, the Crusaders, and the rest are the Jews. Anyway, this is all laid out in his 1996 fatwa, which titled Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. It's also laid out in his 1998 Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders. Right, which really is a fatwa, which is to free Jerusalem, get the infidels out of all Islamic lands, out of the Middle East, out of Muslim countries. And this is exactly what Muhammad had promised to do in the 7th century to his followers. And if they were faithful followers, they would always have growing territorial control, right? And this is exactly what the promise of the restoration of the caliphate is. So it's very much it's very much a indictment of modern Muslims that they allowed infidels in the Middle East, and that's why they have been bested by America. That's why they were poor, not strong, right? And it's a rallying call to fight back and reclaim what was their destiny, really is what that was. But yeah, for Bush, it's very simple. Go after the evildoers, and then you probably know there's a lot of goodwill for America initially, globally, but that dissipates in the actions that America takes after 9/11, which is super unfortunate. Action in Afghanistan follows right away, which is appropriate, but then Iraq, right, quickly followed. So in Afghanistan, bin Laden was not found, and what we get is this one of the longest wars in modern times. And in the latter case, Iraq, the administration began to place its trust in these unreliable suspicions, this so-called intelligence regarding Iraq's alleged, quote, weapons of mass destruction, unquote. This idea that Saddam Hussein had not eliminated his chemical weapons after the Gulf War. right? And he might have an active weapons program that could threaten Israel. Now, this belief starts to grow in spite of 700 inspections by a United Nations team, right? As well as inspections by the CIA, all of which found zero evidence of this. Now, Dick Cheney is the main architect of the WMD myth. And really, he's motivated by a desire for regime change to finish that job that Bush Sr. didn't finish. But he's not the best salesman. Colin Powell, though, is, and he's the one who sells this to the United Nations. Colin Powell has a stellar reputation from Desert Storm and before, and he was actually top dog over Desert Storm, and he was a public face of that very successful intervention. And now he is President Bush's W's Secretary of State. And he's using his reputation to help convince the world that Saddam Hussein is an imminent threat and that the U.S. intel is not false, right? And that Iraq actually had not destroyed its special weapons in compliance with U.S. mandates, which, as it turned out, it had. Anyway, you know what follows from that, and whether from films or best-selling books, Americans learned again that when war is profitable, there's going to be more of it. And the war in Iraq saw a massive growth in private military contractors such as Eric Prince's Blackwater Security Consulting, as well as Vice President Dick Cheney's Halliburton Oilfield Services. So the cynic would say that's what it was about. Yeah, Blackwater has now been renamed Academy. Anyway, it profited enormously with the contract for guarding U.S. officials in Iraq, as it does all over the world and continues to do. Halliburton Oilfield Services paid Cheney $34 million severance when he left his position as CEO of that corporation in order to join the White House. And then it gets nearly $40 billion in contracts related to the Iraq War. Eric Prince grew up in Holland, Michigan. He's a good old boy, and he's still out there. And he sold his company during Trump's second term, and by this point he's supporting conspiracies and lies through Project Veritas. So somehow he branches out into that. Look it up. Interesting, though, that this privatization, much criticized, but it still goes on to this day. As of 2025, private sector companies are involved in deportations from the states through contracts with U.S. immigration for detention facility operations. They're privately run, transportation, technology services, all of that to immigration and customs services. So there's a built-in incentive then for what happens on that front. Now, by the time Obama took office, the fact that American troops remained in both Afghanistan and Iraq really confirmed to many that this neoconservative war hawks, that Dick Cheney and all, had brought the U.S. another preventable, misdirected quagmire and profited immensely by doing so. And everyone wants out. But extricating the U.S. military was not easy. This is Obama's goal, and he eventually delivered. But that doesn't mean the war was over, the war on terrorism. A change in administrations did not really mean retreat. So the war on terror ramped up in another way, not so much with boots on the ground, but with a huge escalation in American drone attacks. And in the end, and this isn't well known either, Obama ordered 10 times as many counter-terror strikes as had Bush. With hundreds of assassinations each year of his tenure, right, all in a handful of Middle Eastern countries, thousands in Pakistan, where bin Laden is, and other Middle Eastern countries as well. In the end, about 5,000 militants are killed in strikes, and bin Laden himself finally killed in 2011 in a raid on his compound in Pakistan. Now, taking it closer to home, the revolution and expansion in domestic security and in-state intelligence apparatus, that whole massive apparatus, that's the other long shadow of 9/11. And that starts immediately with the Patriot Act. And you can see its full name right there. It's an acronym. This is in some ways like prior wartime measures, like the 1917 Espionage Act, which gave the feds the right to deport enemy aliens from America. But this takes it one step further. This gives the feds exceptional powers, including indefinite detention without trial of any immigrant or non-citizen. Just an amazing reach of power here for basically anyone in the globe. Also expanded powers of surveillance within America and without phone tapping, this kind of thing, and unprecedented sharing between intelligence agencies in America. It basically gives the state enormous scope to crack down on enemies within and without. And as a result of this, we have a direct result of that. We get Guantanamo Bay, where the U.S. used another new power under the Patriot Act, which is called extraordinary rendition. Now, this is simply doublespeak for kidnapping, because really that's what it is. You can apprehend, detain, and also torture anyone suspected of being involved in 9/11. Now, torture, of course, goes by another doublespeak, and that is enhanced interrogation techniques. And pretty soon we all learn about waterboarding and other techniques that are used in Guantanamo Bay. Now, the incredible thing is that Americans are learning what has been learned many, many, many times, which is that anyone will give false confessions under torture, so they're never seen as valid. And this, it's incredible to me that this had to be relearned, especially because there's been multiple examples of this in recent history. Perhaps the most recent being what the French experienced in North Africa when they went to war against the independent faction there, the FLN, used torture and extracted whatever they wanted, and it's useless, right? So the evidence is never much good. And the upshot of that is that these trials of these close to 800 detainees go on and on and on. There's also the problem of false arrests and mistaken identities and all the rest, and ruined lives that way. Finally, in 2009, Obama orders closure within a year of Guantanamo, and he promises to pursue lawful alternatives for detainees through the regular court system, not military tribunals in America. But that gets quashed because of opposition in the U.S. Congress on the grounds of national security. So that plan was killed. And as of 2025, 7 men are still in the military trials process, including the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He's been in one long legal proceeding since 2006. Finally, in 2024, a plea deal was struck for a life sentence rather than execution. Execution has been the goal of every administration since the beginning, since his arrest. But that plea bargain, finally late arrived at, is appealed by Biden's government, because no administration wants to be the one to accept a plea bargain, especially for someone like this, Mohammed. So it goes on and on. By 2025, there are only 9 convictions of those close to 800 detainees, and almost all of them were on reduced charges, pleas. And worse than that, the U.S. federal courts since overturned some of those convictions in whole or in part. Okay, so that's one thing. We also have North Americans become very familiar with, and Americans more so, enhanced border security and the NSA, right, the National Security Agency. These become familiar terms to a generation that suddenly, and with varying degrees of alarm, traded privacy and civil rights for security, and then comes to really regret it. Because the extent of government surveillance is underappreciated, and what the government would do when they had these powers was naively not expected. That's really till Edward Snowden goes public. So he's that NSA contractor who blew his whistle and ends up having to defect first to Hong Kong and then to Russia, which is fascinating in itself. That is 2013, becomes a Russian citizen, and obviously the American government, safe from the long arm of the American state. In any case, what he revealed is that NSA surveillance was far wider than we had thought. Its collections of phone and email and internet activity from millions of Americans, and all told, up to 1 billion users worldwide. Okay? So you give the government an inch, they take a mile, seemed to be the lesson here. And though the Patriot Act would expire finally in 2019, and it was given several extensions, and much of it would be ruled unconstitutional, we have the other aspect of 9/11, which is unprecedented expenditure on border security, and that continued unbroken from 9/11 right up until Trump's "Build a Wall" campaign slogan, right, and his showdown with Congress over its financing. Now, to switch gears to another theme from the 1990s, all this doesn't come cheaply, this war on terror, and so what you would get is that debt clock that I talked about that had been turned off just before 9/11 gets restarted shortly after. But it's not just government that's going in debt in what are called the aughts, right? The 2000 to 2010. It's also Americans are becoming more leveraged than ever, more consumer debt than ever. And there's alarm bells raised about that, as there are again today. Now, most consumer debt is mortgages, and worse in this period because of very easy credit. And also the banking deregulation that we had going back to the Reagan era, right? And that banking deregulation allows for some really toxic investment products, okay? And these are made up partly, largely, really, of really shaky mortgage debt. And the problem is not that people are in debt, it's that anyone can get there. And the whole system is built into debt, which is more than they should be. And the whole system is built on the assumption of continually rising house values. Right? So Wall Street is what they're doing is they're packaging low down payment or even no down payment low interest mortgages, which are known as subprime mortgages, often with teaser rates that later go up. They're packaging those into financial products called mortgage-backed securities, MBSs, and also in what are called collateralized debt obligations, CDOs. Now, these are investment products that are sold to investors, right, with guarantee or with expected returns, not guaranteed returns. But these securities do have high returns, and they often have really high ratings from credit agencies, in spite of the fact that a lot of these mortgages are very fragile. So there's a real risk to these things, right? And these mortgage loans in these financial products are just bad. There's even what are called no doc loans, no document loans, where people are getting approved for mortgages based not on their income, nothing to do with them, no documents required from you about your credit rating or whether you have anything. It's simple, or even a job. It's simply based on the value of the home that you are buying. That is the only thing that matters, which is just incredible because it suggests the assumption is that house value is unchangeable or always rising, right? So yeah, at the time we called them, cynically, we called them ninja loans, right? I don't know if you heard that term, ninja loans, but it's no income, no job, approved. But yeah, this is what's happening. And everyone can smell that this is probably not good. Easy credit, of course, means housing speculation. It means increasing prices. It also means massively increasing housing starts up to 1.2 million in 2006, which will drop by two-thirds by 2008. And that's where we're going. It all falls apart. Okay, now if you've seen the movie The Big Short, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. If you haven't seen it, definitely watch that movie. It's amazing. But the shakedown, the breaking point, it all really begins with fear. That's always how it happens. Fear that the housing market is frothy. And that's all it takes. That one word in this comment by Alan Greenspan saying that and Alan Greenspan is chair of the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. So when he says it, that really triggers it. And he made a conjectural comment that perhaps the housing market is frothy, right? And you can see there when he makes that comment there in that one graph that I supplied there, it's a bit fuzzy, but the Greenspan comment and what happens not that long afterwards. and we get this collapse. And it starts with the housing bubble burst. Okay, that's where it begins, the big recession. And many borrowers now are defaulting on their loans because their houses are underwater. And it's as you can see there in the price index, the Case-Shiller index, it plummets nationally by about a third, right? House prices. So someone with nothing down is now 1/3, 30, whatever percentage underwater, however many 100,000 that might be. But in any case, yeah, it's worth nothing. People are walking away, right? And Wall Street is holding the bag on these securities that are now useless, right? That are valueless, and they also plummet sometimes to nothing. And that leads to this domino effect that completely crippled the financial system. And the first to go under is Lehman Brothers. Now, this is a massive shock because they've been around since 1850, and they're simply gone, and very quickly. Now, at first, and this is a vivid recall of this, of Bush saying he's not going to be bailing out Americans and bailing out firms, but he has to, and Obama does as well, and takes that to a whole new level because we're heading into the Obama administration just as this begins. So yeah, at first no talk of saving these firms, and in fact the government says they won't, but as more and more start to teeter, the feds do start to bail them out, right? And we get that term too big to fail. The economy depends on them staying alive, right? So basically Wall Street is saved by the taxpayer. And more fundamentally, what we're getting here is that the deregulation movement finally catches up to us, right? With the biggest economic collapse since 1929. Now the fallout is huge, and it's mitigated now by unprecedented federal bailouts, which is what makes it a bit different than the Great Depression. That speed with which the Congress and the executive responded to this, and what we get are these TARP programs, Troubled Asset Relief Programs, and there's several of those, and they run to trillions of dollars. The feds are also directly bailing out Detroit because Detroit automakers also go under. The two of the big three automakers, Chrysler and GM, both go into receivership as the economy fails and as credit dries up. So for the average Americans, impact is felt by pretty much everyone, some more than others. And Las Vegas, for example, you see house prices drop 65% by the time it bottoms out in 2010. California also, you get smaller cities in the Bay Area or south of LA, or San Joaquin Valley, like places like Fresno would see drops of about 60%. Disproportionately, though, it is African Americans who feel the worst of this, and for the simple reason being that black households hold nearly 2/3 of their wealth in housing. So African American households, nearly 2/3 of their wealth is in housing, which is very different than most Americans who own the majority of their wealth is in investments, in equity stocks, right? And yeah, those stocks took a beating, but they come back, and they come back very well. Housing wealth, not so much. So it has appreciated since 1950, and in fact, that wealth gap between blacks and whites, which was narrowing since the emancipation, obviously, and throughout the 20th century, somewhat. It really started narrowing from the 60s to the 80s, but then then it stayed level basically, and largely that's because of what happened here in the housing crisis. The recession of 2008. So since that point, stock equity has appreciated by 5-fold. Okay, so anyone who put money in an S&P index fund in 2015 in the stock market, when the impact of the recession is over, has seen a 5-fold increase in their wealth, right? And you can see that in your statements if you invested them. But housing went off a cliff in value, right? And many at the very bottom completely lost their homes, and they never really came back. Now, these large price increases in equity markets, as I said, 5-fold since 2015, have led to this disproportionate capital gains for the wealthiest Americans, and that group is almost exclusively white. So long story short, if none of that made sense to you, that's okay, because the white-black wealth gap remains about 3 to 1 is my point. Slightly worse, in fact. The average African American has 30 cents on the dollar from what the average white American has. And that's exactly where it was in 1980. So yeah, the impact of 2008 is disproportionately carried by those with the least, but that also includes poor whites, working class whites. And it's not only this, it's also the fact that the 1980s and 1990s brought seismic shifts in economics, right? With a couple things. One, globalization of trade, massive. Secondly, automation, also massive, right? Both of those mean the same thing. They mean a steady erosion of solid wage jobs in manufacturing, right? Well-paying jobs in manufacturing. Those jobs are gone. Added to that, you've got the computer revolution. This also means new barriers for older workers, right? The newly unemployed older worker. The digital divide is the new term describing that, right? Between those who young enough to have. And yeah, the digital age has really reshaped America, economics, politics, and culture. One example, cable news just fell off a cliff after peaking early into the 21st century, replaced largely by more convenient clickbait and social media platforms, especially Facebook and YouTube, also Reddit, Twitter, and others. Print media experiences this slow but consistent decline, with advertising revenue plummeting pretty quickly, sales following. Um, and you get the first of these historic papers, such as Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which is established in 1863, falling and only going online. Social media then raises new concerns over fake news, and debates start among academics about what's happening to America's center. New reality emerges of terms you're familiar with: confirmation bias and online radicalization. Now, in extremes, you see this in high-profile conspiracy theorists gaining followings, and we get some lone wolf terrorists that are radicalized online, like in tragedies like the Charleston church shooting of 2015. And yeah, in that way, America's not exceptional. No country has been immune to this kind of lone wolf online, terrorism. Almost always a white extremist, but not always. But more troubling, you get this cultural disaggregation, that Americans no longer all watching Walter Cronkite and in the evening, right after in the 50s and 60s almost. More and more, they're in their own partisan echo chambers. And that contributes to this massive partisan divide, right? That Trump manipulated so very, very well. So overall, right, this early 2000s optimism about the web's revolutionary informational potential due to its democratic nature, right? It really didn't last that long. And at the same time, the digital economy is making these Silicon Valley techies like Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Jack Dorsey, Jeff Bezos into these multi-billionaires and really global cultural influencers, right? So extending that American influence into this new era. And changing everything, right? By 2018, esports is estimated to have more viewers than almost every professional sport. And a big moment there was 2016, when the League of Legends World Finals had 43 million viewers, which is the NBA Finals of Game 7 that year at 31 million. Meanwhile, Amazon, 1996, right, reshapes retailing. Airbnb begins in 2008. That completely shakes the hotel industry. Uber, Lyft, right, they're 2009 and 2012. They take on the taxi industry. And for a time, this was, and maybe you recall, this was all hailed as the new sharing economy, right? And in some ways, there were elements of that, but really, mostly what we have here is right, this turning back, this undoing of decades of really hard-won gains by organized labor in what is already the least unionized country in the West, and this growing precariat, this new term, the precariat class of casual, low-skilled e-laborers who are almost never organized, right? We also get, on the other side, this new source of national wealth, adding to the economy enormously, right? The digital economy in the States is 4.9 trillion by 2025, which is over 10% of the nation's entire economy, and contributes to or supports over 8 million direct jobs. And those jobs have very high compensation on average. And that 8 million, interestingly, is about twice the auto industry. So it really has supplanted that old manufacturing base. But yeah, economic insecurity, the precariat which I'm talking about here, is also a big part of the story of the return of populism in the form of more MAGA politics, because we've seen Make America Great Again already. But it seemed to confirm what H.L. Mencken had predicted 100 years before, that on some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron. And this happens, right? But it's also identity politics, left and right. On the one side, you got Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and on the other, you've got Unite the Right, Trump's base, war against the left, social programs, right, diversity, equity, inclusion programs. So these really fundamental divides that are exacerbated in the digital age. You also have this war on critical race theory, which is this new invented neoconservative term out of Florida, which really just means teaching American history without ignoring slavery and racism and all the bad stuff. So what is this? Is it the same thing that we've seen so many times before? This rise of the right and Trump, and are there lessons from 1920? When populism was fed by fear of change, by stresses of real changes, right? Racial, political, sexual, religious. Recall that we've seen this movie before, and that in H.L. Mencken's day, American anxieties were manifest in the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, right? And in race riots, and in that really racist Anti-Immigration Act of 1924. So yeah, we've been there before. And the populism of Trump's terms 1 and 2, it likewise is part of an anxiety over social decline from the left behind working class, especially working class American male. Okay, so here's where I kind of want to encourage you as we head towards the end of the lecture, that racism and xenophobia, they have always existed in America, but a generation or two ago, white Americans didn't typically think of themselves as a victimized minority who are mistreated by elites that they see as indifferent to their problems, right? And in some ways, they really have, the Trump base, they really have been left behind by their leaders, right? The Democratic Party used to be the party of the working classes, of organized labor, and increasingly in the 21st century became the party of urban professionals, right? Part of that digital divide, the winners in the digital divide that separates coastal America from what became known as the flyover states, right? The Trump land. Okay. But yeah, great quote by Francis Fukuyama there. One of the great drivers of the new nationalism sent Trump to the White House has been the perception of invisibility. The resentful citizens, fearing the loss of their middle class status, point an accusatory finger upward to the elites who they believe do not see them, but also downward toward the poor who they feel are unfairly favored. And for that segment of the population, that left behind, largely white working class, which means not college educated, the decline is real. And again, it's largely thanks to what we've talked about in this lecture: globalization, automation, the gig economy. Okay, we've really seen a steady erosion in opportunity in working class America. And you can map that. You can map it in crime, in drugs, in family breakdown. And here's a map from 2016. Heavy drug use led to more than 60,000 overdose deaths that year in the United States, about twice the number of deaths from traffic accidents in the country. Now that's only going to climb. It climbs to 110,000 in 2023 before dropping off somewhat. Now, the region where you see that most profoundly is the heartland of the Rust Belt, which voted heavily for Donald Trump, right? The Rust Belt and Appalachia. And you can see that here in this map, the change in intensity between Democratic to Republican voting in 2016, right? So where Donald Trump is getting his big wins is exactly that area where the left behind white working class resides. Now, another stat on this left behind group is the fact that, yeah, uh, they are not in a good place. Life expectancy for white American men fell between 2013 and 2014. Now, this is a really unusual thing in a developed country. And the proportion of white working class children growing up in single parent families went from 22% in 2000 to 36% in 2017. These are bad statistics, right? And of course, Trump is a master of stoking resentments of the politics of division. Okay? Now, and here's where we get to the encouraging part that I promised, because this isn't super encouraging. But just to tell you, there is a realistic, or there is a base, there is a reality to these grievances, right? And what sends Trump to the White House. With that, there's a lot of talk that under Trump, America becoming a fascist state, right? Both in his first and second term, that the president acting like a dictator, right? And there's lots of evidence for that, using the courts to go after enemies, targeting independent law firms with executive orders as retribution because they represent his political enemies. That's definitely from a dictator playbook. Right, or going after the same for diversity and inclusion policies, whether it's independent firms or colleges, right? Suing independent media for defamation, right? Withholding money from Ivy League universities till they agree to get rid of DEI programs, and even till they agree to oversight. In March 2025, Columbia agreed to demands from the Trump administration to give oversight of its Middle East Studies Department to the feds. Now, this is in order to restore federal funding to Columbia. And at that point, some academics said Columbia doesn't exist anymore. It is no longer an independent institution. And we get an outmigration of some academics who have seen this before and are scared of what they're seeing, or say we've seen this before in history, namely Weimar Germany. But in any case, you even have the president saying that congressional reps should be executed for encouraging servicemen to not follow illegal orders from the president of the United States himself, from POTUS, from the White House. Yeah, so that's all real bad. But though America's never had an executive branch staffed with less qualified people, you've never seen this level of stupid in the White House, shite house under Trump, really. There has been far worse, okay? And that's important to remember. America's been through worse, and not only in the 19th century, okay? Not just the Millard film morons. Anyway, we've got the Hoover-Harding era of the 1920s, which I just talked about, the rise of the Klan. We've got the McCarthy era of the 1950s, where people's careers were ruined simply on suspicions of being communists, right? And lifetimes, really. We've got LBJ lying to Americans about the war in Vietnam, right? We've got Tricky Dick Nixon lying about his dirty trick campaigns. So yeah, for me, I really take reassurance in looking at that, right? And in looking at the Great Depression, okay? And the fact that in that crisis moment, the American working class, what do they opt for? They don't go for extremism. They go for socialism. Okay? So not for fascism, but for the New Deal. So in the biggest crisis America ever had, Americans go hard left, not hard right. Okay, democracy survives, unlike what happened in Europe. Okay, and the Klan, which in the 1920s went to a peak perhaps of 6 million. It just plummets. It dropped to about 350,000 before the decade's end, right before 1930. So, right, I find that very encouraging, right? And that, yeah, there's a consensus by the 1930s over the New Deal, right? So the crisis of the Depression is the swan song for hard right populist approach of that time. And perhaps we can see the same today, that America today is also not as divided as Fox News would have us believe, or CNN. Okay, so America today is not as divided as we tend to believe, and that's again a function of our echo chambers. For one, and I'll give you some encouragement on this. Income inequality growth really started to reverse overall in 2017, even though it remained stagnant for African Americans. But income inequality started to reverse in 2017. Second thing, there is a pretty broad consensus among most Americans on the things that we think they are radically divided on. So there is something we would call a reasonable middle. And there's several examples of that. The majority of Americans, whether they are Republican or Democrat, believe in some form of gun control, right? Of extreme weapons that have no use in certain civilized urban society, right? And that's right. Over 2/3 of Americans do believe in some gun control. Okay? Uh, a majority have middle ground views on abortion access, right, where they they believe it should be available, but restricted in late term pregnancy, right? This is where most Americans land. So, not the positions that you would think of either party, right? And the thing is that Americans don't know that, right? And there's this article that came out in 2018. It's got a great title. It's called "The Parties in Our Heads." Okay, the parties in our heads. So the political parties in our heads, and that's a research paper by Douglas Aller and Gaurav Sood. And they analyze how people misperceive the other side, right? That people significantly overestimate the extent to which party supporters support stereotypical positions. Or even belong to stereotypical groupings like LGBT. Republicans think that 1/3 of Democrats are LGBT. In reality, it's 6%. Democrats think that 1/3 of Republicans are wealthy or that they earn more than $250,000 a year. It's actually 2%. Okay, so ideas really increased partisan animosity is what I'm saying. There is this reasonable middle, right? And that because of hyperpartisan media, it's not widely known. But it's encouraging to know that it's out there, and that it will turn, right? Things always do. And finally, this is not today the old racism. This is not what we're seeing from the Trump base, the build the wall rhetoric. Yes, there is some latent racism here and often overt, but also and more so, and don't forget that 1/3 of Latinos in America voted for Trump in 2016. More so, it's about wanting a solution to the asylum seeker problem. Okay, here's a name I want to give you: Fareed Zakaria. Fareed Zakaria, Indian-born American journalist. He's a pundit, and he's got a new book called Age of Revolutions: Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present. And in it, he points out that he historicizes the Trump build the wall chant, right? And he says that if you look more closely at that, it's really a reaction to abuses of the asylum system. Okay, and the asylum system comes about. Well, asylum happens after World War II. North Americans, the US and Canada, took in millions of refugees from the war, but they were all immigrants, right? There was no asylum status. 1978 in Canada, 1980 in the US, we get this new category, asylum category in the Immigration Act, right? And initially, only a very few were eligible. Okay, but that number keeps growing. More important, so the category gets wider, but more important, wannabe Americans, and they're all over the world, obviously, are mostly they're economic migrants, and they see the asylum category as a way to jump the queue, to jump to the front of the line, and that's really what drives this explosion. So you have, for example, tens of thousands of people coming to Central America and to Mexico from all over the world. And yeah, showing up at the Mexican-US border, and under asylum laws, once you're in the States, you get a court date. That takes 6 months to a year. You can appeal that one, you're guaranteed a second, and that can take 7 years. Meantime, you're in. And this is what Americans wanted reformed. Everyone, Democrats under Biden included, okay, admitted that the system was broken. And in fact, Harris's role under Biden was to work on the root causes of the asylum overload. Right? Trump owned it, though, with his nonsense promises about building a wall, about making Mexico pay for it. And of course, that's not going to happen, but he gets the vote out. Okay, so what changed here then? Well, in the 1920s, building that wall is about social Darwinian fears, right? That we will go backwards down the evolutionary ladder through miscegenation, right? That's not there anymore, right? What's also changed from more recently is that, right, as I said, white Americans did not typically think of themselves as a victimized minority, mistreated by elites, right? But populism then and now are not the same, all right? And to the extent that the populism of the 2020s succeeds, it will hurt America as much as it helps it. And that is what will get Americans to again vote left. I really believe that this MAGA phenom, the anti-elitism of the 2020s, is really all about dismantling and disrupting these power structures that really benefit America. Okay, and yeah, it's kind of a gleeful tearing up, or at least moving away from all these global agreements that Americans built in the post-war era, the military and trade deals, right? So in that, those who supported Trump are really giving up on a huge advantage that America has. And again, read Zachariah here because he talks about that. Compared to a country like China, the U.S. has dozens of treaty agreements with dozens of wealthy nations. China really has none other than North Korea. The U.S. is richly multicultural today, and most Americans do not want to turn back on that, right? They've been massively successful in absorbing talent from all over the world, right? And J.D. Vance's own wife is an example of that. Her family story, right? Europe is not. It's not come close to that success of multiculturalism that we have in North America. Asia, even less so, right? So, and there's my plug that America will play to its strengths again. All things swing back, and they will. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that rant was helpful for you and put things in context. Historicizes things. Thanks for listening. Any questions? 100%. Let me know.